Yoshiyuki Tomino created the original Gundam in 1979, this much is known. But I would also like to posit that Gundam created Yoshiyuki Tomino as well as a name that has what we call cultural cachet. Tomino is many things, but when he gets behind the wheel of creative direction, sometimes he likes to go spinning off an embankment in a spectacular fireball. Sadly, I can't call Overman King Gainer a spectacular fireball because it's neither true nor thematically appropriate for a show that takes place primarily in an icy tundra. No, Gainer is not a fireball, nor is it particularly spectacular. It's full of ideas that play just plain odd, and seems to be missing about a half or season or so prior to the show's beginning. But that's kind of part and parcel with the way that Tomino writes things after he stopped writing Gundam. Kind of in the same way that Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda is much less well known than Star Trek, shows like Gainer and Brainpowered are far less well loved by the mecha loving populace than his most famous work. Everybody remembers Starship Troopers, not so many people remember The Roads Must Roll. Of course, that's not a statement of quality on Heinlein's part, but the same can't be said about Gainer here. So, of course, as always, some background. The story is nominally an adaptation, and an extremely loose one at that, of a French novel series called La Compagnie de Glace, or The Ice Company. I must confess that I haven't read The Ice Company because it's 97 fucking books long, and only one is actually in English. And obviously it's been a minute since French class, kids. At any rate, the phrase fucking of course it is comes to mind. I'm relatively certain that any similarities to the original story pretty much stop at about the time that the mecha and the women in leather fetish wear are introduced, but it's French, so who's to say? That being said, the Ice Company series takes place on an iced over Earth where people lived in cramped cities controlled by railroad companies. Same wise in Overman King Gainer, which finds us watching an exodus from a Siberian city, in which they take large parts of the actual city and just tow it out like tugboats and barges. Gutsy, if a little on the slow side. This leads the Siberian Railroad Police to come after them at the behest of the London International Management Authority. The IMA wants people to stay put because they get taxes and control out of it, obviously. And the people who want to do an exodus, and that's kind of how they phrase it in the show, want to get back to basics and be an independent country. These two ideologies cannot survive the other's existence, as you can well imagine. Caught in the middle of this are Gainer Sangha, a game-playing shut-in, his high school friend Sarah, and the mysterious Gain Bijou. Yes, the main character's name is Gainer. He has a cohort named Gain, and his mech is called the Gainer. Oh, this is easy to write with katakana, said Tomino as he looked across his desk. I bet I can get extra mileage out of this. Gainer gets caught up in the rain that Gain is spearheading and ends up falling into the antique Overman, which he later names King Gainer. Gainer takes up the role of protector of the Japan Exodus because really who else is going to fucking do it? Since he's played so many video games that are basically Overman fights, he's the best pilot candidate. From here, he fulfills the same story as Amuro does in the original Gundam show, and yes, I will be making a few more comparisons and references to Gundam. That's maybe a little unfair because Gundam actually had like locale changes and characters that were memorable. Sarah, already having a mech ready for her, gets a silhouette machine, which is basically a Terran from Gundam 00 with about half the charm. And just like that, it's off we go. They're a bunch of side characters, but their arcs don't come to mean anything because this show has had as much planning behind it as falling down a flight of stairs. They seem to spend an awful lot of time in mortal danger, fucking around, and having kind of pointless moments. Mainly because Tomino smelled burnt toast and thought it was 1982 again, back in the good old days when he was working on Zabungle. There are times when this is actually very easy to compare this to Zabungle as well, though I feel like Zabungle feels fresher and less seat of its pants. That might be the vintage on it, though. When you're watching something from 2002, you kind of expect that it would have something a little more like nuance to it. Something from 1982 feels like it has the room to be a little bit more primitive because of its age. That might just be hindsight on my part, though. I will say that for all the dicking around they do, it does come to a point later on, but that's major spoiler territory. Even for a show I'm not being particularly kind to, I'm not going to dump that on you just yet. But while you're in the middle of it, it feels interminable. Now, pacing is a funny thing that way. You don't notice it's not there and then you really miss it. This show, fittingly enough for a series about dragging cities across a tundra, drags ass. Yes, that makes sense narratively, but when it feels like a huge long story section is devoted to fuck all, especially to someone who's just watching it consecutively, well, I got bad news for you. The story itself seems to float in arcs that mostly exist to flesh out certain characters, but the characters are so stock that fleshing them out seems like it's just going through the motions. I will say that they don't kill off characters willy-nilly like Tomino is wont to do. The show reiterates the characters' motivations loudly, just in case we forget, between episodes, like Asaham's hatred of Gain for sleeping with his sister and naffing off. Being a low-rent Char clone like he is, Asaham's motivations are fairly Freudian, and they definitely escalate beyond the pale as the story goes forward. It's very Tomino-esque writing. The heroes are good, but conflicted about what they're doing. The villains are confident in their own righteousness, but ultimately come up short against the heroes because of hubris or sudden bouts of stupidity. That's just how Tomino writes, and, that's kind of nice. But when you've watched a lot of Tomino's work, you're like, oh, I can set my watch to it. Whatever the case, the first big bad, Adet, ends up joining the White Base, or the Exodus. You know what I mean. The second, Asaham, ends up being more or less the most consistent threat, sending Adet's former minions after her and the rest of the Exodus and just kind of being terrible. He's got some massive inferiority issues, to say the least. After that was Kashmir, who was just Makuve from Gundam with a worse outfit. At least he thought tactically and tried to divide the Exodus from within, but ultimately all that came to naught too. The final baddie of note is Cynthia Lane, who's introduced earlier as being on par with Gainer in game-playing skills. She's also on par with him as far as piloting, because of course she is, and she's been training with the St. Reagan Corps, and that makes a big problem for the Exodus. It's here that she realizes for the first time that combat is not a video game, which seems like a very I am old and trying to make a point with my commentary sort of thing to put in a show. But that's me. To be a bit more fair, it's more of a commentary on training up child soldiers with video games, but it's handled so ham-handedly, so the full depth of the message just kind of falls apart. So by the end, the biomechanical and completely unexplained Overmen have strange minds of their own, and this has worrisome implications for the pilots, but it all sorts itself out, because of course it does. The problem that arises, a monstrous Overman called the Overdevil is introduced so late in the game that there's no impact to it. There's no feeling like the heroes could have prevented its advent because they didn't have a clue it existed in the first place. Sounds kind of like a writing room. The writing staff also seems to freely admit their loss of ideas too, if the way that Gainer explains things in the catch-up segments is to be believed. And on top of all that, they tag Gainer as basically being a new type because sure, why not? You may as well just have leaned over and nudged us and said, hey, remember Gundam? Oh, whatever. It's 100% unfiltered Tomino, and that's not as good of a thing as I want it to be. This is bloody comical, considering the last video I produced at time of recording is how you should try and establish certain kinds of technology in your story if that tech is important, and they just don't bother here. So with plot lines coming to naught, character motivations and development left in the dust, and the overall story just kind of going nowhere, Overman King Gainer is a show that somehow spends its entire running time never getting out of the starting gate. I never felt like they made any progress towards their goals, never had much of an idea of where they were in the world, and certainly no idea if there was a point to the whole damn thing. Overman King Gainer is a story where Tomino wanted to explore some ideas he had, but he didn't really know what he wanted to do with them, and to be honest, he should have just been exploring them in a novel where editors would remind him that story structure exists, but instead we get a show that meanders and putters around and then comes careening into an ending that feels unearned and overall unsatisfying. The dub is from the mid-2000s, and while the actors are trying their best, just try acting with this material. Considering how much techno-gibberish is present, I don't envy any translators and actors with this stuff. Pure, unfiltered Tomino is kind of a hassle to sit through as a finished product. I can't imagine it's any better to try and maneuver around behind the scenes. So this is the part where I theorize about how you can make sure that people who are quote-unquote auteurs make good work consistently. And it breaks down something like this. You sit your auteur down at a desk, whether it's Hideo Kojima, or Yoshiyuki Tomino, or George Lucas, or J.J. Abrams, or anybody who has great ideas, but maybe not enough sense in their head. You sit them down and you let them go. You just let them spill their story out. You write everything down. And then you tell them, okay, well, these are the things that don't work. these are the things that are stupid and pointless diversions. And when they say, no, I want to keep that in, then you bash the back of their head in with a fucking baseball bat. And then once they get up from being unconscious, then you say, do you want to try that sentence again? And then they kind of dribble and bleed a little bit. But the point is that you need somebody standing behind all of these auteurs with a sock full of pool balls and just nut them every single time that they pull some stupid bullshit like that. Star Wars was saved in the edit. Gundam was saved in the edit. There are dozens of movies and TV shows out there that are saved in the edit because people with a little bit of sense could go up against the people with the big ideas. And every time poor Tomino puts out a show where nobody is standing behind him with a sock full of pool balls, well, this is what happens. Big shrugs, big sighs. With a bunch of fucking G-Reco remakes in the wings, then I just have to sit there and think, well, here we go again. Overman King Gainer is not streaming anywhere at time of recording. It's not been re-released on DVD, so good luck finding it. I just happen to have an old copy laying around. Consider maybe that the point of your creation is to stand as a testament to your own hubris. Consider maybe that the point of something that you've created is to be a template of what not to do. And if any aspiring writers, artists, and otherwise are out there listening to this, I actually do recommend that you watch Overman King Gainer and mark down the points that you realize that you're no longer interested or invested in the story. And then do everything in your power to make sure that you don't do that in your own work. For the rest of us, however, it doesn't have much in the way of efficacy, and it's another notch on Tomino's belt of shows that he directed, but that's about it. At the end of the day, I think the most you can get out of King Gainer is to watch the opening credit sequence and have a laugh. That being said, this is Professor Otaku, the greatest American anime critic, signing off.